In a quiet, suburban neighborhood where most confrontations are limited to disputes over property lines or barking dogs, something extraordinary was unfolding. A woman stood firmly at her doorway, face to face with uniformed police officers attempting to gain entry to her home. What made this encounter remarkable wasn't just the sudden police presence in this peaceful community, but the identity of the homeowner, the daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman. As flashing lights reflected against the windows of neighboring houses, curious onlookers began to gather, unaware they were about to witness a masterclass in constitutional rights. Where are you watching this video from today? Let us know in the comments below. The tension had started building on what had been an otherwise unremarkable Thursday evening. Elizabeth Hackman, who had deliberately maintained a low profile despite her father's fame, was preparing dinner when the unexpected knock came. Unlike her father, who had portrayed both law enforcement and criminals with equal conviction throughout his illustrious career, Elizabeth had chosen a different path, studying constitutional law. The knocking at her door grew more insistent, commanding rather than requesting attention. Through the peephole, Elizabeth could see 3 uniformed officers standing on her porch, their postures rigid and authoritative. Their patrol cars were parked haphazardly in her driveway, lights still flashing, but sirens mercifully silent. The neighborhood had always been the kind where police visits were rare, making their presence all the more conspicuous. Elizabeth took a deep breath, composed herself, and opened the door, but only partially, keeping the security chain firmly in place. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you. Please remove the chain and open the door fully," the lead officer stated, his tone making it clear this was a command, not a request. His nameplate read, Officer Daniels, and unlike his 2 colleagues who stood slightly behind him, he made no attempt to soften his approach with even a perfunctory smile. "Good evening, officers. May I ask what this is about?" Elizabeth responded, her voice steady despite the unexpected confrontation. Years of watching her father navigate the complexities of fame had taught her how to maintain composure under pressure. The security chain remained in place, a small but significant boundary between her private domain and the state authorities standing on her porch. Officer Daniels shifted his weight, visibly annoyed at what he perceived as non-compliance. "We've received reports of suspicious activity at this address. We need to come in and take a look around." His hand moved to rest on his belt, not quite touching his weapon, but close enough to subtly emphasize his authority. Elizabeth's expression remained unchanged, but her mind was racing, cataloging details, the vague justification, the absence of a warrant, the subtle intimidation tactics. "Officer Daniels, I'm not aware of any suspicious activity here. Unless you have a warrant, I'm not legally obligated to let you enter my home." The officers exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a direct and informed response. The younger officer behind Daniels shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the situation was not going to follow the usual script. Officer Daniels, however, seemed determined to maintain control of the encounter. "Ma'am, obstructing a police investigation is a serious offense. We're not asking for your permission. We're informing you that we need to enter these premises." His voice had hardened, and he stepped closer to the door, as if proximity alone might intimidate Elizabeth into compliance. A lesser-known detail about Elizabeth Hackman was that she had not only studied constitutional law, but had worked as a civil rights attorney for several years before shifting to teaching. The Fourth Amendment was not an abstract concept to her, but a living principle she had defended countless times. Police intimidation tactics were familiar territory, even if experiencing them firsthand on her own doorstep was jarring. "Officer, I'm not obstructing anything. I'm exercising my constitutional rights. Without a warrant, probable cause, or exigent circumstances, you do not have the legal authority to enter my home." Elizabeth's tone remained respectful but unwavering. "If you'd like to explain the specific nature of these reports you've mentioned, I'm happy to address any legitimate concerns." The standoff continued as neighbors began to watch more openly from their windows and porches. The quiet neighborhood rarely saw such drama, and Elizabeth knew that every passing minute made this increasingly embarrassing for the officers. Daniels seemed to realize this too, his frustration evident as he glanced at the growing number of spectators. "Listen, Miss," he began, but Elizabeth interrupted him. "Hackman. Elizabeth Hackman." The name hung in the air for a moment, The younger officer's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Any relation to Gene Hackman, the actor?" he asked, breaking protocol by speaking out of turn. "He's my father," Elizabeth replied simply, not elaborating further. She had spent her life avoiding trading on her father's name, but she recognized that the dynamics of the encounter were shifting. The revelation seemed to give the officers pause, perhaps realizing that this confrontation might have greater visibility than they had anticipated. Officer Daniels appeared unmoved by this revelation. "Ms. Hackman, regardless of who your father is, we still need to investigate these reports." "And I'm still entitled to my Fourth Amendment protections, regardless of who my father is," Elizabeth countered. "If you have legitimate suspicions, get a warrant. I'll be happy to cooperate with a properly executed legal document." As the standoff continued, neighbors had begun to edge closer, some even taking out their phones to record the encounter. What had started as a seemingly routine police visit was evolving into something more significant, a public demonstration of civil liberties in action. Elizabeth stood firm, neither antagonistic nor intimidated, simply adhering to her rights with unwavering precision. The evening breeze carried snippets of concerned whispers from the gathered neighbors. Why are they targeting her? Does someone have a grudge? Should we do something? The collective gaze of the community was becoming another factor in this increasingly complicated situation. Officer Daniels, sensing his tactical advantage slipping away, attempted a different approach. "Ms. Hackman, we're just trying to do our job. We got a call, and we have to follow up on it. Surely you understand that?" "I absolutely understand you have a job to do, officer," Elizabeth replied, "and I respect that. But I also understand the limits of police authority as defined by the Constitution. Those limits aren't inconveniences to be worked around. They're essential protections for every citizen." The youngest officer, whose nameplate identified him as Officer Chen, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He whispered something to his colleague, then addressed Elizabeth directly. "Ms. Hackman, can I ask if you've noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood lately? Any unfamiliar vehicles or people?" This more reasonable approach gave Elizabeth room to engage constructively. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Officer Chen. It's been a quiet month. May I ask what specifically was reported?" Chen looked to Daniels, who reluctantly elaborated. "We received an anonymous call about potential drug activity at this address." Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh, the absurdity of the accusation momentarily breaking her composed demeanor. "Drug activity? In my home? I don't even drink coffee because the caffeine makes me jittery." As if to emphasize the point, the smell of her interrupted dinner, a vegetable stir-fry, wafted through the partially opened door. The contrast between the wholesome cooking aroma and the accusation of illicit drug activity wasn't lost on anyone present. The growing audience of neighbors had transformed what should have been a private encounter into an impromptu community event. Across the street, Mrs. Winters, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 4 decades, stood on her porch with arms crossed, her disapproving gaze fixed on the officers. Next door, the Martinez family had emerged from their evening routine, father and teenage son standing shoulder to shoulder, watching with obvious concern. Every witness added another layer of complexity to what the officers had likely expected to be a routine call. Officer Daniels, increasingly aware of the spectacle unfolding around him, lowered his voice in an apparent attempt to regain some privacy. "Ms. Hackman, sometimes these anonymous tips turn out to be mistaken, but we still have to investigate. It would be much easier for everyone if you'd just let us take a quick look around." Elizabeth maintained her position in the doorway, the security chain creating a symbolic and literal boundary between state authority and private sanctuary. The warm glow from her home contrasted sharply with the harsh police flashlights that occasionally swept across her face. She was dressed casually in jeans and a simple blouse, hardly the image of someone engaged in criminal enterprise, yet here she stood, defending her home from unwarranted intrusion. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm not going to waive my constitutional rights for the sake of convenience," Elizabeth replied. Her voice remained steady, educational rather than confrontational. An anonymous tip without specific, articulable facts indicating criminal activity does not constitute probable cause. The Supreme Court has been very clear on this point. The middle officer, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward slightly. His nameplate read, Officer Ramirez. Ms. Hackman, are you an attorney? He asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than challenge. I was a practicing civil rights attorney for 7 years before I began teaching constitutional law, Elizabeth confirmed, which is why I'm particularly sensitive to Fourth Amendment violations. This revelation changed the atmosphere subtly, but significantly. Officer Ramirez exchanged a meaningful glance with Officer Chen, while Officer Daniels' jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. They were no longer dealing with an ordinary civilian, but someone intimately familiar with the legal boundaries they were pushing against. Well, Professor, Daniels said, emphasizing the title with a hint of mockery, while you're giving us a constitutional law lecture, real police work is being delayed. If you have nothing to hide, this could all be over in 5 minutes. Elizabeth didn't rise to the bait. That argument, that innocent people should have nothing to hide, fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of constitutional protections. They exist precisely to prevent the state from intruding into citizens' lives without proper justification. The burden of establishing that justification falls on you, not on me, to disprove it. Several neighbors had begun recording the encounter on their phones, the soft glow of their screens visible in the gathering dusk. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into an inadvertent public education in civil liberties. Elizabeth was aware of the audience, but remained focused on the officers before her. Officer Chen, the youngest of the three, consulted his radio briefly before addressing his superior. Sir, dispatch is asking for an update on our status. This interruption seemed to force Officer Daniels to reassess the situation. What should have been a quick compliance encounter had stretched into a standoff that was consuming time and drawing unwanted attention. His options were narrowing: either escalate further, potentially creating a public relations problem, or find a face-saving way to retreat. Ms. Hackman, Daniels said after a moment's consideration, would you be willing to answer some questions here at the door? That might satisfy our need to follow up on this report. Elizabeth recognized this as a potential compromise. I'm happy to answer questions, officer. That's a reasonable request that doesn't infringe on my Fourth Amendment rights. The tension in the air diminished slightly as this new approach took shape. Officer Ramirez produced a notepad while Officer Chen stepped back slightly, creating a less confrontational arrangement. The neighbors watched with interest as the dynamic shifted from confrontation to conversation. How long have you lived at this address, Miss Hackman? Ramirez began. 7 years this coming August, Elizabeth replied. And you live alone? I do, though my father visits occasionally. The questioning continued along standard lines, her routine, her observations about the neighborhood, whether she'd noticed any unusual activity. Elizabeth answered each question thoroughly and truthfully, maintaining her composure throughout. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her, being interrogated about drug activity while her vegetable stir-fry grew cold inside, but she recognized the importance of the principle at stake. As the questioning progressed, a subtle shift occurred in the officer's demeanor. Officer Ramirez, in particular, seemed to be conducting the interview with increasing perfunctoriness, as if going through the motions to complete a report rather than pursuing a genuine lead. Officer Chen had taken a step back, occasionally scanning the growing crowd of neighbors with evident discomfort. Only Officer Daniels maintained his rigid stance, though even he seemed to recognize that the situation had evolved beyond his control. The neighborhood had become an impromptu courtroom, with Elizabeth Hackman conducting a masterclass in civil liberties while ostensibly just answering routine questions. Have you had any unusual visitors recently, Ms. Hackman? Ramirez asked, flipping to a new page in his notepad. Define unusual, Elizabeth replied, not confrontationally, but seeking clarity. People you don't know well, who might have been acting suspiciously, staying for very short periods, Ramirez elaborated. Officer Chen consulted his watch, then leaned in to whisper something to Officer Daniels. The lead officer's expression soured, but he nodded curtly before addressing Elizabeth again. Ms. Hackman, based on your responses and our observations, we've determined that the anonymous tip was likely unfounded, Daniels stated, his tone formal and stiff. We apologize for the inconvenience. Elizabeth nodded, acknowledging the conclusion without gloating. I understand you were following procedure, officer. I appreciate your professionalism. This magnanimous response seemed to catch Daniels off guard. Perhaps he had expected hostility or triumph rather than this measured courtesy. Officer Ramirez closed his notepad with a gesture that suggested relief, while Officer Chen had already begun retreating toward their patrol car. "We'll be noting in our report that the resident was cooperative in answering questions," Ramirez added, a small but significant acknowledgement that Elizabeth had indeed been reasonable within the boundaries she had established. As the officers prepared to depart, Elizabeth remained in her doorway, still protected by the security chain. The encounter had ended without her capitulating on the core principle. Her home had remained inviolate, despite the pressure to allow entry without proper legal justification. The gathered neighbors had begun to disperse, many offering nods of approval or thumbs-up gestures to Elizabeth as they retreated to their own homes. The neighborhood had witnessed something important, a textbook example of civil liberties in action, not as an abstract concept, but as a living principle defended with knowledge rather than confrontation. As the police cruisers pulled away from her driveway, their red and blue lights fading into the evening, Elizabeth finally closed her door completely, sliding the security chain free with a metallic whisper that seemed to mark the conclusion of the standoff. She leaned against the closed door for a moment, allowing herself to acknowledge the adrenaline that had been flowing through her system. Despite her outward composure, the confrontation had affected her more deeply than she had allowed the officers to see. In her kitchen, the abandoned stir-fry had cooled, no longer releasing its aromatic invitation. Elizabeth scraped it into a container for tomorrow's lunch, her mind replaying the encounter, analyzing what had transpired and what might have happened if she hadn't stood her ground. The knock at her back door startled her from these thoughts. Through the window, she recognized Mrs. Winters waving tentatively, her phone still clutched in her other hand. Elizabeth opened the door, releasing a sigh she hadn't realized she was holding. "Elizabeth, dear, are you all right?" Mrs. Winters asked, her concern evident in the furrows of her brow. "I've never seen such a display in all my years in this neighborhood. First the Hackman girl, then the police. It's like something from one of your father's movies." "I'm fine, Mrs. Winters, thank you," Elizabeth assured her. "Would you like to come in?" "I was just about to make some tea." The invitation was partly genuine hospitality and partly a recognition that the community would be buzzing with questions. Better to address them directly than allow speculation to flourish. Within minutes, Elizabeth's kitchen had become an impromptu neighborhood gathering. Mrs. Winters had been joined by Tom Martinez and his son Miguel, whose live stream had apparently garnered significant attention online. The Johnsons from 2 doors down arrived with a freshly baked pie. "Stress eating is better with company," Diane Johnson announced as she set it on the counter, and even Mr. Peterson, the reclusive widower from the corner house, had made a rare appearance. "Your video has over 2,000 views already, Miguel," Tom Martinez said, glancing at his son's phone with a mixture of concern and pride. "People are calling Elizabeth a hero in the comments." Elizabeth shook her head, uncomfortable with the characterization. "I'm not a hero, just someone who knows her rights. Those officers were just doing their job, following up on what was clearly a false report." "But that's what was so impressive," Miguel interjected, his teenage enthusiasm breaking through. "You didn't yell or get all dramatic. You just knew stuff. It was like watching a real-life example from my government class." Elizabeth smiled at the unexpected educational impact of the evening's events. "Well, if it helps make constitutional rights more tangible for you, then something good came from this disruption." "What I don't understand," Mr. Peterson said, speaking for the first time since arriving, "is why our house, this neighborhood, isn't exactly a hotbed of criminal activity." The question hung in the air, giving voice to the underlying concern that had been circulating among the neighbors. Random police visits based on anonymous tips were rare enough to raise suspicions about motivation. "I've been wondering the same thing," Elizabeth admitted. "Anonymous tips don't materialize out of nowhere. Someone deliberately sent those officers to my home tonight." "Could it be related to one of your cases?" Tom Martinez asked. "From when you were practicing law?" Elizabeth considered this. "It's been 3 years since I left practice for teaching, and I was careful about maintaining boundaries with clients, but I suppose old resentments can resurface." "Or maybe it's someone at the university," Diane Johnson suggested. "A student who received a poor grade, perhaps." Possibly, though this seems extreme even for grade disappointment, Elizabeth replied. She had been a demanding but fair professor, known for rigorous standards, but also for her willingness to help struggling students. Mrs. Winters, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly straightened in her chair. What about that development company? The one that's been buying up properties in the neighborhood? Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you speak against their zoning request at the city council meeting last month? Elizabeth's expression shifted as connections began forming in her mind. Westbridge Development. Yes, I presented research showing their environmental impact assessment was flawed. She paused, remembering the representative's thinly veiled irritation when the council had voted to delay approval pending further study. But sending police to my home over a zoning dispute seems disproportionate. Maybe not if millions of dollars are at stake, Mr. Peterson countered. I worked in real estate development before retiring. These delays cost money, sometimes enough to sink an entire project. People have resorted to dirty tricks for far less. The gathered neighbors exchanged troubled glances as this possibility took root. What had seemed like an isolated incident was potentially part of something larger, an attempt to intimidate or discredit someone who had become an obstacle. If that's true, Tom Martinez said slowly, then this might not be the end of it. They tried intimidation through official channels tonight. What happens when that doesn't work? The implication sent a chill through the room. Elizabeth had faced pressure during her legal career, but the possibility of being targeted in her own neighborhood, where she had always felt secure, was unsettling in a fundamentally different way. We should document everything, Miguel suggested, his generation's instinctive response to potential injustice. I've got the live stream saved, and Mrs. Winters took photos. If anything else happens, we'll have a record. And we should watch out for each other, Mrs. Winters added firmly. This neighborhood has always taken care of its own. If Elizabeth is being targeted, then they're coming after all of us. The spontaneous solidarity was touching, transforming what had begun as an invasion of privacy into something that strengthened community bonds. Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for these neighbors, many of whom she had known only through casual greetings before tonight. Thank you, all of you, she said sincerely. I hope this is nothing more than a misunderstanding or a random false report, but knowing I have neighbors looking out for me means more than I can express. As if summoned by this moment of connection, Elizabeth's phone rang. The screen displayed Dad, Gene Hackman himself, perhaps calling for their weekly check-in. The timing was uncanny. Excuse me, I should take this, Elizabeth said, stepping into the living room for privacy. Hi, Dad. Elizabeth. Her father's distinctive voice, instantly recognizable to millions but comfortingly familiar to her, came through clearly. I just got a strange call from a reporter asking for comment about police raiding your home. What's going on? Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, realizing the incident was already spreading beyond the neighborhood. Her father's fame would inevitably amplify the story, adding a layer of public scrutiny she had spent her life avoiding. It wasn't a raid, Dad. Just some officers following up on a false report. I'm fine, really. She tried to keep her tone reassuring, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily. A false report about what? The protective edge in his voice was unmistakable, even after all these years. They claimed there was drug activity at my address, which is ridiculous, Elizabeth explained. I didn't let them in without a warrant, answered some questions at the door, and they left. It's over. The silence on the other end suggested her father wasn't entirely convinced. Do you need me to come down there? I can be on a plane tomorrow. No, Dad, really. I handled it. Elizabeth glanced back toward the kitchen, where her neighbors were engaged in animated conversation. Actually, the whole neighborhood rallied around me. It was quite moving, actually. Well, that's something at least, Gene Hackman replied, the concern in his voice mellowing slightly. These neighbors of yours, they're good people? They'll look out for you? Elizabeth watched through the doorway as Mrs. Winters sliced her pie, distributing pieces with the practiced efficiency of someone who had served countless school lunches and community potlucks. Miguel was showing Mr. Peterson something on his phone, the generational divide temporarily bridged by shared purpose. The Martinez family had begun making notes, establishing an informal neighborhood watch schedule. Yes, Dad, they're good people, she confirmed, a smile warming her voice. Better than I realized, honestly. That's important, Elizabeth. Community matters when trouble comes knocking. The wisdom in her father's voice reflected decades of life experience that transcended his on-screen personas. Your mother and I worried when you chose to live alone, especially after you left the law firm. Having neighbors you can count on, that eases my mind. Elizabeth felt a familiar blend of affection and mild exasperation. At 73, she was hardly a vulnerable young woman needing protection, yet in her father's eyes, she would always be his daughter first, accomplished professional second. I know, Dad. Listen, I should get back to them. We're trying to figure out if this was random or something else. Something else? His actor's ear caught the hesitation in her voice. Elizabeth, what aren't you telling me? She sighed, knowing her father's persistence. There's a possibility, and it's just a theory right now, that this might be connected to a development company whose zoning request I opposed at City Council last month. The silence that followed held a different quality than before. This was her father processing information, assembling pieces like he would for a complex character study. Westbridge Development? He finally asked. Elizabeth blinked in surprise. How did you know that? I still follow local news wherever you live, honey. Old habits from when you were practicing law. Their CEO, Harold Westman, I met him once at a charity event in New York. Not a man who takes obstacles lightly. This unexpected connection startled Elizabeth. The world her father inhabited, of influential executives, charity galas, and powerful networks, seemed far removed from her deliberately modest academic life. Yet here was a thread connecting them, and potentially connecting her quiet neighborhood to forces with troubling resources at their disposal. Dad, I need to go, she said decisively. My neighbors are waiting, and we have some planning to do. Of course. Call me tomorrow with an update. A pause, then. Elizabeth, be careful. If Harold Westman is involved, this won't end with one visit from local police. As Elizabeth returned to the kitchen, the conversation among her neighbors had evolved from concerned speculation to practical planning. Tom Martinez, who worked in IT security, was discussing home surveillance options, while Mrs. Winters had compiled a contact list for everyone on the block. Elizabeth, Diane Johnson called as she re-entered. We've been thinking. If someone is trying to intimidate you, we should be prepared for escalation. Miguel's video is drawing attention online, which might deter them, or might make them more determined. Elizabeth took a seat at her kitchen table, now covered with hastily drawn neighborhood maps and contact information. My father just mentioned something interesting, she began, explaining Gene Hackman's unexpected connection to Harold Westman. Mr. Peterson whistled low. That adds another dimension. Westman might not have known who he was targeting when he started this, but he certainly will now. The Hackman name changes the equation. For better or worse, Elizabeth agreed. Media attention could be a deterrent, but it might also make this a matter of pride for Westman. Backing down publicly could damage his reputation in business circles. So, what do we do? Miguel asked, the excitement of earlier now tempered by the gravity of the situation. Elizabeth considered for a moment, her legal training asserting itself. We document everything. We establish patterns if they exist. And most importantly, we prepare without escalating. If Westman is behind this, he's hoping I'll overreact. Give him something he can use against me, maybe even something to discredit my testimony about the environmental assessment. Mrs. Winters nodded approvingly. Strategic thinking, that's what we need. The gathering continued well into the evening, transforming from a crisis response to something resembling a community strategy session. Neighbors who had barely exchanged more than polite greetings for years discovered shared resources and complementary skills. Mr. Peterson had maintained detailed records of all neighborhood activities since his retirement, providing a baseline against which to measure unusual occurrences. Diane Johnson, as a nurse at the local hospital, had connections throughout city services that might prove valuable for information gathering. Around midnight, as the impromptu meeting finally began to disperse, Tom Martinez lingered behind. Elizabeth, there's something you should know, he said once the others had left. Miguel didn't just happen to start filming tonight. He's been documenting unusual vehicles in the neighborhood for a school project on urban transportation patterns. Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, sensing the significance. And a chill ran through Elizabeth despite the warm night. Surveillance, she murmured. They were watching before sending the police. Tom nodded grimly, which suggests this wasn't a random intimidation attempt. They were establishing patterns, learning when you're home, perhaps looking for anything they could use. I'd like to see Miguel's footage, if that's all right, Elizabeth requested. Of course, he's already uploading it to a secure cloud folder. I'll send you the access information. Tom hesitated, then added, Elizabeth, I work in cybersecurity. Your digital presence might be at risk too. When was the last time you changed your passwords or checked your accounts for unusual activity? The question triggered an unsettling realization. Elizabeth prided herself on her privacy awareness, a necessity in her former career, but had grown more relaxed in her academic life. It's been longer than it should be, she admitted. First thing tomorrow, we should do a security audit, Tom advised. If they're watching your physical movements, they might also be monitoring your online activities. After Tom left, Elizabeth secured her home with particular attention, checking locks, drawing blinds, activating the security system she had rarely used. The comfortable sanctuary of her home felt subtly altered, the shadows deeper, the creaks of the old house more pronounced. She moved through the rooms methodically, a ritual of reassurance rather than fear. In her home office, she opened her laptop and began changing passwords, starting with email and banking. As she worked, a notification appeared, an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Reconsider your position." Elizabeth's finger hovered over the mouse, hesitating between opening the message and deleting it unread. Either action felt like a significant choice, a step toward confrontation or retreat. Finally, she took a third option, creating a screenshot to document its arrival before moving it unopened to a new folder labeled Evidence. The game was escalating faster than she had anticipated. From police at her door to digital intimidation in the span of hours suggested resources and determination beyond what she had initially suspected. As Elizabeth finally prepared for bed in the early morning hours, she realized that the neighborhood meeting had been more than community support. It had been the formation of an alliance necessary for what was to come. Dawn broke with unusual activity in the typically quiet neighborhood. From her bedroom window, Elizabeth observed Tom Martinez installing surveillance cameras at strategic points around his property, while across the street, Mr. Peterson sat conspicuously on his porch, binoculars ostensibly trained on bird life, but conveniently positioned to monitor the street. The community mobilization had been swift and organic, transforming ordinary suburbanites into an impromptu security network. Elizabeth's phone chimed with a text message from her father. Called a friend at the LA Times. Story about police intimidation tactics against academic freedom running tomorrow. No direct mention of you, but enough pressure to make certain people nervous. She smiled at her father's characteristic approach, leveraging influence without fanfare, applying pressure at strategic points. Gene Hackman had always understood power dynamics, a talent that served him well both on screen and in navigating Hollywood's complex hierarchies. Elizabeth had inherited that instinct, though she channeled it through legal frameworks rather than industry connections. After responding with thanks, Elizabeth opened her laptop to face the day's first challenge, the unopened email from the previous night. With Tom Martinez connected via video call to provide technical security guidance, she carefully opened the message, recording the process as potential evidence. The email was brief and coldly professional. Professor Hackman, your opposition to the Westbridge development project appears to be based on incomplete information. Our environmental assessments were conducted by respected professionals using standard methodologies. Your public statements have potentially damaged our reputation and delayed an economically beneficial project. We would welcome the opportunity to provide you with our complete data and address your concerns personally. Perhaps after reviewing our full documentation, you might reconsider your position. Regards, Harold Westman, CEO, Westbridge Development. Seems innocuous enough on the surface, Tom commented, viewing the forwarded message. But coming right after the police visit, the timing makes it intimidation, regardless of the polite language. Elizabeth nodded, professional instincts analyzing the subtext. Notice he doesn't mention the police visit or deny any connection to it. Also, the implication that my academic assessment was unprofessional. That's laying groundwork to discredit me. Not immediately, Elizabeth decided. Let's see what else develops today. Response or silence both send messages, and I need to decide which serves our strategy better. As Elizabeth prepared for her morning class at the university, her phone rang with a local number she didn't recognize. Warily, she answered on speaker, allowing Tom to listen from the video call. Elizabeth exchanged glances with Tom's image on her laptop. The local newspaper's interest wasn't surprising given Miguel's viral video, but the framing of the question, unwarranted search rather than police visit, suggested they'd received specific information from someone with an agenda. "Thank you for your interest, Ms. Wei," Elizabeth replied carefully. "There was a police visit based on what appears to have been a false report. The officers acted professionally, and after a brief conversation at my door, they determined there was no basis for the report and left. No search was conducted, warranted or otherwise." The specificity of the question confirmed Elizabeth's suspicions. Someone was attempting to shape the narrative, either to paint her as a conspiracy theorist if she agreed, or to bury the connection if she denied it. "I have no evidence of any connection," Elizabeth stated truthfully. "As a former attorney and current professor of constitutional law, I deal in facts rather than speculation. If evidence of such a connection emerges, I would consider it a serious matter of potential corporate intimidation." The reporter pressed further. "Would you characterize the police visit as intimidation, Professor Hackman?" "I would characterize it as officers responding to a report, as is their duty," Elizabeth countered smoothly. "The question of who made that false report and why is where any investigation should focus." After ending the call, Tom whistled appreciatively. "You handled that like a pro. Didn't give her a sensational quote, but planted the seed about corporate intimidation." "Old habits," Elizabeth acknowledged, "but this confirms the situation is escalating. Someone wanted that story in the paper, either to intimidate me further or to frame me as overreacting." Tom frowned. "You still planning to go to campus today? Might be safer to cancel classes until this settles." Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "Retreating is exactly what they want. My constitutional law students have a midterm review today, and I won't let this situation interfere with their education." As Elizabeth gathered her teaching materials, another text arrived. This one from Diane Johnson. "Blue sedan spotted at corner of Maple and Elm. Miguel filming from upstairs window. Same plates as before." The surveillance was continuing more blatantly now. Either Westman was growing desperate or becoming overconfident, neither of which boded well for de-escalation. Elizabeth forwarded the information to Tom, then made a decision. Opening her email, she composed a brief response to Harold Westman. "Mr. Westman, I appreciate your offer to provide additional environmental data. As an academic, I always welcome more comprehensive information. However, I'm concerned about certain irregular activities in my neighborhood that followed my counsel testimony. Perhaps we could discuss both matters in a public setting, such as my office at the university, with appropriate witnesses present. Transparency serves everyone's interests in matters of community development. Regards, Professor Elizabeth Hackman." Sending the message felt like advancing a chess piece, a move that acknowledged the game without conceding ground. By suggesting a public meeting with witnesses, she was signaling awareness of potential intimidation while maintaining professional courtesy. Elizabeth left for campus with heightened awareness, noticing details of her surroundings she might normally have overlooked. The positions of parked cars, the faces of strangers, the rhythms of neighborhood activity disrupted by the previous night's events. Mrs. Winters waved from her garden, the casual gesture belying her strategic positioning that offered clear sightlines of Elizabeth's driveway. At the university, Elizabeth found unexpected support awaiting her. Dr. Jensen, the department chair, intercepted her in the faculty parking lot. "Elizabeth, a word before you head in," he called, approaching with uncharacteristic urgency. "I've received an unusual call from the university's major donor's office. Someone's been making inquiries about your position here, your tenure status, research funding." Jensen nodded grimly. "Apparently, a board member of their parent company sits on our capital campaign committee. Nothing explicitly threatening was said, but the implications were clear. Questions about whether your public statements represent the university, whether your research funding might be reevaluated. The good news, Jensen continued, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the humanities building, is that the provost was furious when I reported the call. She's preparing a statement on academic freedom and the university's commitment to independent faculty research. Your position is secure, Elizabeth. This institutional backing was significant. Westman had misjudged the university's principles, or at least underestimated the administration's willingness to defend them publicly. As Elizabeth entered her classroom, she found her students unusually attentive, several with open tabs, displaying Miguel's viral video on their laptops. Elizabeth surveyed her classroom from the podium, noting the unusual energy among her typically studious but reserved constitutional law students. Their gazes held a new intensity, laptops open not just to case notes, but to social media feeds where Miguel's video had continued to gain traction overnight. Some students whispered among themselves, falling silent as she arranged her materials. "Good morning," Elizabeth began, her tone deliberately normal despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Before we begin our midterm review, I should acknowledge what some of you may have already seen online. Yes, I had an encounter with police officers at my home last night. Yes, I declined to allow a warrantless search based on an anonymous tip. And yes, this provides us with an excellent real-world example of Fourth Amendment protections in action." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the classroom. They had clearly expected her to avoid the subject rather than incorporate it into the curriculum. Elizabeth smiled, finding steady ground in her role as educator despite the turbulence in her personal life. "In fact," she continued, "let's use this as our starting point today. Jensen versus Mississippi established what three-part test regarding anonymous tips as a basis for warrantless searches." Hands shot up across the room, the students energized by the intersection of academic theory and their professor's lived experience. For the next hour, Elizabeth guided them through Fourth Amendment jurisprudence with renewed vigor, drawing parallels between landmark cases and her doorstep constitutional stand. As the session concluded, a student named Aisha lingered behind, approaching the podium with evident concern. "Professor Hackman, is it true this might be connected to your testimony against that development project? My father works in city planning, and he said the Westbridge proposal had serious environmental issues they were trying to hide." Elizabeth considered her response carefully. "I can't confirm any connection, Aisha, but I will say that standing up for environmental protections sometimes comes with challenges. Your father's work in city planning is vital precisely because it provides oversight for projects that might otherwise prioritize profit over community welfare." Aisha nodded, then hesitated before adding, "My father also said Westbridge has a history of trying to discredit opponents. They hired private investigators to follow a council member in Phoenix last year after he opposed one of their projects." This new information sent a jolt through Elizabeth. "Thank you for sharing that, Aisha. Would your father be willing to speak with me about what he knows? It could be very relevant to my current situation." Elizabeth gathered her materials, this new context heightening her understanding of what she faced. If Westbridge had established patterns of intimidation across multiple jurisdictions that transformed her individual experience into potential evidence of corporate malfeasance on a broader scale. As she crossed campus toward her office, Elizabeth's phone vibrated with an incoming email. Harold Westman had responded to her invitation with surprising swiftness. "Professor Hackman, I appreciate your willingness to meet, though I must express concern about your implication of irregular activities in your neighborhood. Westbridge Development operates with the highest ethical standards. However, I agree that transparency serves everyone's interests. Rather than meeting at the university, I propose lunch tomorrow at Riverside Restaurant, a public venue where we can discuss both the environmental data and any concerns you may have. I'll bring our Chief Environmental Officer to address technical questions. Regards, Harold Westman." Elizabeth paused on the tree-lined path, analyzing the counteroffer. The restaurant was certainly public, eliminating obvious safety concerns, but removed from her institutional support system at the university. The inclusion of their environmental officer suggested Westman was at least maintaining the pretense of addressing her scientific objections, though she suspected the meeting's true purpose lay elsewhere. Before she could formulate a response, her phone rang. Mrs. Winters, calling with urgent news. "Elizabeth, dear, there are people at your house, 2 men in suits, knocking at your door." When they got no answer, they walked around the property, looking in windows. Miguel is filming from our upstairs bedroom, and Mr. Peterson confronted them when they tried to enter your backyard. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Did they identify themselves? They claimed to be from the City Housing Inspection Department, but Mr. Peterson asked to see identification, and they returned to their car without showing any. They're parked down the street now, watching the house. Call the police, Elizabeth instructed firmly. Report trespassers attempting to enter a private residence under false pretenses. I'm heading home now. As Elizabeth hurried to her car, she called Tom Martinez, who promised to meet her at her house. The collective neighborhood response was mobilizing with impressive efficiency, transforming individual concern into coordinated action. Driving through familiar streets, Elizabeth formulated her strategy. This escalation, from police visit to surveillance to attempted illegal entry, created a clear pattern that could be documented and potentially used to file for a restraining order against Westbridge or its agents. If Aisha's father could provide evidence of similar tactics in other jurisdictions, the pattern would strengthen further. Elizabeth parked and approached the gathering, which now included several other neighbors who had emerged to witness the commotion. The officer, a woman whose nameplate identified her as Rodriguez, turned as Elizabeth approached. Ms. Hackman, I understand this is your residence, Officer Rodriguez stated. Your neighbors reported potential trespassers. That's correct, Elizabeth confirmed. I was at the university teaching when I received the call about unknown men attempting to enter my property. Officer Rodriguez nodded, her expression professional but sympathetic. Mr. Peterson provided a description and partial license plate. We've also been informed about the incident last night, involving our officers responding to an anonymous tip at this address. The reference to the previous night suggested internal department communication. Elizabeth's encounter with officers Daniels, Ramirez, and Chen had been noteworthy enough to circulate within the force. This could work to her advantage if the department was now treating activities at her residence with greater scrutiny. Does this department have a protocol for potential harassment cases? Elizabeth asked, her tone collegial rather than confrontational. I'm concerned these incidents may be escalating. We do, Officer Rodriguez confirmed. I'd like to take your formal statement, and we can discuss protective measures if appropriate. As Elizabeth provided her statement, Tom Martinez arrived, followed shortly by Miguel with his camera equipment. The impromptu security network was evolving into something more structured, neighbors with specific roles, documentation procedures, communication channels. What had begun as intimidation was inadvertently fostering a community resistance that transcended ordinary suburban detachment. Officer Rodriguez, after completing her report, offered additional patrols for the neighborhood and provided Elizabeth with direct contact information for the department's community liaison. I should mention, she added quietly as she prepared to leave, that Officer Chen spoke highly of how you handled yourself last night. We don't often encounter civilians who understand their rights so thoroughly without becoming confrontational. This small revelation, that her respectful but firm stance had earned professional respect within the department, suggested Elizabeth might have inadvertently gained allies in unexpected places. As Officer Rodriguez departed, the neighbors gathered on Elizabeth's porch to strategize. I've combined Miguel's footage from both incidents into a single timeline, Tom explained, showing the assembled group a professional-looking video compilation on his tablet. It clearly establishes a pattern of escalating harassment. Mrs. Winters produced a notebook filled with meticulous observations, times, vehicle descriptions, behaviors. Mr. Peterson had mapped surveillance patterns based on multiple neighbors' sightings of the blue sedan. Diane Johnson reported that hospital colleagues had confirmed no city housing inspections were scheduled for their neighborhood. The collective intelligence gathering was impressive, transforming individual observations into compelling evidence. Elizabeth felt a swell of gratitude for this unexpected alliance, even as she recognized that Westman's tactics had severely miscalculated the community response they would provoke. What about the lunch invitation? Tom asked when Elizabeth shared Westman's email. It could be an opportunity to gather information, but also a risk. I think I should accept, Elizabeth decided after consideration, but with conditions and definitely not alone. Elizabeth's kitchen had transformed into an impromptu command center by evening. Laptops, notepads, and takeout containers covered the table as her neighbors worked with surprising efficiency to prepare for her meeting with Harold Westman. Tom Martinez had created a secure digital folder containing all evidence gathered thus far: Miguel's videos, Mrs. Winter's observation logs, photographs of the suspicious vehicles, and time-stamped records of every incident since the initial police visit. "You should wear this," Diane Johnson said, presenting Elizabeth with what appeared to be an ordinary lapel pin featuring the scales of justice. "My brother works in private security. It's a recording device with 4 hours of battery life and enough storage for continuous audio. Completely legal in this state for single-party consent situations." Elizabeth examined the pin with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief at how quickly their response had evolved from shocked neighbors to what felt remarkably like a coordinated intelligence operation. "Thank you, Diane. I hadn't even thought about recording the conversation." "Just remember to engage him in specific admissions if possible," Mr. Peterson advised, his years in real estate development providing valuable insights into corporate tactics. "Get him to acknowledge awareness of the police visit or the men at your house today. Even denials can be telling if you phrase the questions right." "And don't go alone," Mrs. Winters insisted, her grandmotherly concern hardening into something more tactical. "Not just for safety. Witnesses change dynamics." Elizabeth nodded, having already considered this essential precaution. "I've asked Professor Jensen from my department to join us. As department chair, his presence adds institutional weight without seeming confrontational." Westman agreed to the addition when I responded to his invitation. "Smart," Tom approved. "Professional, but protected." As the strategy session continued, Elizabeth's phone rang, her father calling for his promised update. She stepped into the living room for privacy, still somewhat uncomfortable with her neighbors, witnessing her relationship with her famous father. "Dad, you're on speaker with me and some neighbors," she said, deciding transparency was simpler than attempting to summarize their collective efforts later. "Hello, everyone." Gene Hackman's distinctive voice filled the room, instantly recognizable to the gathered neighbors, despite his efforts to maintain a low public profile in recent years. "I understand you've been looking out for my daughter. I'm grateful." The neighbors exchanged glances, momentarily starstruck despite the serious circumstances. Mrs. Winters recovered first, her practical nature asserting itself. "Mr. Hackman, we're just doing what neighbors should. Elizabeth has helped many of us over the years. Legal advice for Tom's small business, tutoring Miguel through his civics class, checking in on me after my surgery last winter." "Still, it matters," Gene replied, his voice carrying the gravitas that had defined his film career. "What's the latest, Elizabeth? Has the situation escalated?" Elizabeth provided a concise summary of the day's developments, including Westman's lunch invitation and Aisha's information about similar intimidation tactics in other jurisdictions. Her father listened without interruption, a habit she knew from childhood indicated his full attention. "This pattern matches what my contacts told me about Westbridge," Jean confirmed when she finished. "They've used these tactics in 3 other communities where their developments faced significant opposition. Usually the intimidation was enough to silence critics or force compromises." "Not this time," Elizabeth stated firmly, drawing affirming nods from her neighbors. "I've done some research of my own," Jean continued. "Westman's company has a complex ownership structure, subsidiaries, holding companies, investment groups. But following the money leads to some interesting connections. The primary capital comes from Meridian Global Partners." Tom Martinez looked up sharply from his laptop. "Meridian Global? They've been under SEC investigation for potential securities fraud. Nothing proven yet, but there's smoke." "Exactly," Jean confirmed. "I'm having my attorney compile a detailed ownership map. If Westbridge is using intimidation tactics here, and there's a pattern across jurisdictions, as your student suggested, that information could be valuable to regulatory authorities already looking at their financial backers." Elizabeth absorbed this new dimension, recognizing how it transformed their local resistance into potentially part of a larger accountability process. "Dad, can you send what you have so far? It might be useful in tomorrow's meeting with Westman." "Already on its way to your secure email," Jean confirmed. "And Elizabeth, I've also contacted Jack Reynolds." The name hung in the air for a moment before Elizabeth processed its significance. Jack Reynolds was a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist who had worked with her father on a documentary about corporate environmental abuses years earlier. Their friendship had endured beyond the project, and Reynolds's reputation for exposing corporate malfeasance was legendary. "Dad, that's significant escalation," Elizabeth said carefully, aware of her neighbors listening. "Sometimes the best defense is a credible threat of exposure," Jean replied unapologetically. "Jack's interested in the pattern, especially if it connects to the Meridian investigation. He won't publish without verification, but Westman should know he's looking." After the call ended, Elizabeth faced her neighbors with a mix of appreciation and concern. "I need to be clear about something," she said. "My father's involvement changes things. His public profile, his connections, they provide protection, but also potentially raise the stakes. If anyone feels uncomfortable with this dimension, I completely understand." Mrs. Winters scoffed, dismissing the concern with a wave of her hand. "Dear, we were already in this fight. Having Gene Hackman and a Pulitzer-winning journalist as allies just improves our odds." "Mrs. Winters is right," Tom agreed. "Besides, this stopped being just about you when they tried using false police reports in our neighborhood. That affects all of us, our safety, our property values, our sense of security. This community solidarity, transcending the boundaries of normal suburban relationships to form a coalition against intimidation, continued to move Elizabeth deeply. What Westman had failed to anticipate was how his tactics would transform isolated individuals into a resilient network. As night fell, the group refined Elizabeth's approach for the lunch meeting. The strategy evolved beyond simple defense to controlled counteroffensive, gathering evidence, establishing patterns, and positioning for potential legal action if the intimidation continued. "Remember," Mr. Peterson advised as they concluded, drawing on his business experience, "Westman will present himself as reasonable, concerned about misunderstandings, eager to clarify. That's standard corporate damage control. Don't let polite conversation obscure what's actually happened here." Elizabeth nodded, mentally preparing for the performance aspects of tomorrow's encounter. Harold Westman had likely expected his tactics to encounter an isolated academic, perhaps one unused to confrontation outside scholarly debates. Instead, he would face someone surrounded by community support, institutional backing, legal expertise, and now, the potential for national media attention through her father's connections. As her neighbors finally departed with promises to maintain their vigilance overnight, Elizabeth found herself alone in her home for the first time since the previous evening's police visit. The house felt different, not diminished by the intrusions, but somehow expanded by the community connections that had formed in response. Spaces that had been simply her private sanctuary now held echoes of collective purpose. She moved through her evening routine with heightened awareness, drawing curtains, checking locks, positioning the security cameras Tom had installed. These precautions weren't born of fear, but of strategic awareness, the same clear-eyed assessment that had guided her legal career and now informed her response to intimidation. In her home office, Elizabeth opened her laptop to review the information her father had sent. The ownership charts revealed Westbridge as merely one visible manifestation of a complex financial structure designed to obscure ultimate responsibility. Following the money through this deliberate maze, she began to understand the scale of what they faced. Not just a local development company, but a sophisticated operation accustomed to removing obstacles through whatever means proved expedient. The stakes of tomorrow's lunch extended beyond her personal situation or even the specific environmental concerns she had raised at the city council. This was about patterns of corporate behavior that relied on isolating opposition and applying pressure until it crumbled. By standing firm, not just individually but collectively, they were challenging not only Westman, but the assumption that ordinary citizens could be easily intimidated into silence. Elizabeth closed her laptop with renewed resolve. Tomorrow's encounter would be a performance on both sides, Westman presenting corporate reasonableness while she maintained professional courtesy. But beneath that civil exterior, both would know the true dynamics at play, and Elizabeth now had resources Westman hadn't anticipated when he launched his campaign of intimidation. Riverside Restaurant occupied prime real estate along the city's waterfront, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views that justified the premium pricing. Elizabeth arrived 15 minutes early, accompanied by Professor Jensen, whose silver-haired gravitas and impeccable tweed jacket embodied academic authority. They were shown to a corner table where the spectacular view competed with excellent privacy, a power setting typical of business lunches where appearances mattered as much as conversation. "Remember," Jensen murmured as they settled into their seats, "Westman chose this venue deliberately. The exclusivity, the price point, it's meant to establish dominance through environment." Elizabeth nodded, adjusting the Justice Scales pin on her lapel to ensure optimal recording quality. "Classic power play. My father used to talk about how studio executives would use similar tactics during contract negotiations." "Speaking of your father," Jensen said with a hint of amusement, "the department's social media mentions have increased 800% since yesterday. Apparently, being the academic institution employing Gene Hackman's daughter during a viral rights standoff has raised our profile considerably." Elizabeth winced slightly. "I've tried so hard to establish my career independent of his name." "And you have," Jensen assured her. "Your scholarship stands entirely on its own merit. But I won't pretend the university administration isn't pleased with the positive attention to our constitutional law program. The provost called it serendipitous brand enhancement this morning." Before Elizabeth could respond, she spotted Harold Westman entering the restaurant. Even without prior introduction, his identity would have been obvious. The confident stride, bespoke suit, and proprietorial gaze that swept across the dining room all marked him as someone accustomed to wielding influence. Beside him walked a younger woman carrying a leather portfolio, presumably the environmental officer mentioned in his email. Elizabeth and Jensen stood as the maitre d' escorted Westman and his colleague to their table. "Professor Hackman," Westman greeted, extending his hand with practiced cordiality. "A pleasure to meet you despite the unusual circumstances. This is Dr. Elaine Mercer, our chief environmental scientist." "Mr. Westman," Elizabeth acknowledged, maintaining the professional courtesy established in their email exchange. "This is Professor Robert Jensen, chair of our university's legal studies department." As they settled into their seats, Elizabeth observed Westman with the analytical eye she had developed during her years of legal practice. Mid-60s, impeccably groomed, with the confident ease of someone who navigated corridors of power without encountering significant resistance. His smile reached his eyes, but those eyes remained calculating, continuously assessing. "I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of the Montalcino," Westman said, gesturing to the sommelier approaching with wine. "Unless you'd prefer something else?" "Water will be fine for me," Elizabeth replied pleasantly. "I find I need perfect clarity during technical discussions." A flicker of recalibration crossed Westman's expression, the small adjustment of someone whose assumed script had encountered an unexpected deviation. "Of course. Elaine, perhaps you'll join me?" Dr. Mercer smiled politely but shook her head. "I should maintain focus on the environmental data, Mr. Westman." This second refusal subtly shifted the dynamic, turning Westman's power gesture into a minor isolation. Jensen, reading the moment perfectly, similarly declined, leaving Westman to either cancel the expensive wine or drink alone. He chose the latter, smoothly pivoting as if solo wine consumption at lunch had been his preference all along. "Professor Hackman," Westman began after ordering, "I believe there have been some unfortunate misunderstandings regarding our development project and, potentially, some unrelated incidents that have caused you concern." Elizabeth maintained a pleasant expression, neither confirming nor challenging this deliberate ambiguity. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss both the environmental assessment and these incidents, Mr. Westman. Perhaps we could start with clarifying exactly what you believe these misunderstandings might be." The subtle redirection placed the conversational burden back on Westman, requiring him to establish specific claims rather than dealing in comfortable vagaries. His minute hesitation suggested recognition of the technique. "Certainly," he recovered smoothly. "Dr. Mercer can address the technical concerns you raised at the City Council meeting, which we believe stemmed from incomplete data. As for the other matter, the police visit to your home, I want to assure you that Westbridge Development had absolutely no involvement in that unfortunate occurrence." "Interesting that you're aware of that incident," Elizabeth observed, maintaining her pleasant tone. "I don't believe I mentioned it in our email exchange." A barely perceptible tightening around Westman's eyes acknowledged the misstep. "It was reported in the local paper this morning. A small community like ours. News travels." Elizabeth nodded as if accepting this plausible explanation. And the men who attempted to enter my property yesterday afternoon, claiming to be housing inspectors? Would Westbridge happen to have any knowledge of that incident as well? Dr. Mercer looked up sharply at this, her surprise appearing genuine. Westman's composure showed its first significant crack, a momentary widening of the eyes that suggested either this escalation had occurred without his direct authorization or he hadn't expected Elizabeth to connect it to Westbridge so explicitly. "I'm not aware of any such incident," Westman stated, his recovery admirable but imperfect. "If someone attempted unauthorized access to your property, that's a police matter and entirely unrelated to our company." Jensen leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Westman, as department chair, I'm concerned about potential intimidation of university faculty related to their professional assessments and community service. Would you be willing to state unequivocally that Westbridge Development has not authorized any surveillance or intimidation of Professor Hackman?" The directness of Jensen's question, coming from an unexpected quarter, forced Westman to abandon the gradual conversational approach he had clearly planned. Elizabeth watched the calculation in his eyes, weighing the risks of denial against the implications of refusal to answer. "I can state unequivocally that Westbridge operates entirely within legal and ethical boundaries," Westman replied carefully. "We vigorously defend our projects against misinformation, but always through appropriate channels: public relations, scientific data, community engagement." "That's not quite the unequivocal denial Professor Jensen requested," Elizabeth noted. "But perhaps we should turn to the environmental assessment for now. After all, that's the primary reason for our meeting." Dr. Mercer seized this opportunity to open her portfolio, producing colorful charts and technical appendices. "Professor Hackman, I've reviewed your specific concerns about waterway contamination risks and habitat disruption. Our studies indicate minimal impact when appropriate mitigation measures are implemented." For the next 30 minutes, Elizabeth engaged in detailed technical discussion with Dr. Mercer, demonstrating her thorough understanding of the environmental issues, while Jensen observed Westman's increasingly uncomfortable demeanor. The developer had clearly expected Elizabeth to be less knowledgeable about environmental science, perhaps anticipating that her counsel testimony had been based on generalized opposition rather than specific technical concerns. "Your mitigation proposals for the watershed runoff are interesting, Doctor." "Mercer," Elizabeth acknowledged, "but they don't address the cumulative impact when combined with existing development stress on the ecosystem. The Hackman study from last year demonstrated that even minimal additional disruption could trigger cascading effects." "The Hackman study wasn't peer-reviewed," Dr. Mercer countered. "Actually, it received peer validation in the Environmental Impact Assessment Review Journal 3 months ago," Elizabeth corrected gently. "I can send you the citation." As the technical discussion continued, Westman's initial confidence visibly eroded. He had arrived expecting to manage a situation through intimidation, implied threats, and technical obfuscation. Instead, he faced informed resistance that matched his pressure point for pressure point. When their entrees arrived, he had barely touched his wine. "Professor Hackman," Westman finally interjected, reclaiming control of the conversation. "While these technical discussions are valuable, perhaps we should address the elephant in the room. You clearly believe Westbridge has some connection to the incidents at your home. What exactly would you like from us regarding this matter?" Elizabeth set down her fork, meeting Westman's gaze directly. "Transparency, Mr. Westman. If Westbridge Development has employed any individuals to conduct surveillance or intimidation, directly or through intermediaries, I want that to stop immediately. If similar tactics have been used in other communities where your projects faced opposition, as my research suggests, I want acknowledgement of that pattern." "And if no such tactics have been employed," Westman countered. "Then you have nothing to be concerned about," Elizabeth replied simply. "The evidence will either support or refute any connection. I'm sure we both believe in following where evidence leads." Westman's practiced smile tightened at Elizabeth's implied threat of investigation. The developer glanced at Dr. Mercer, whose focus had remained studiously on her environmental data rather than the increasingly tense undercurrents of the conversation. For a moment, only the ambient restaurant sounds filled the space between them: elegant cutlery against fine china, subdued conversations at neighboring tables, the gentle piano music that complemented Riverside's cultivated atmosphere. Professor Hackman, Westman finally replied, his tone recalibrated to project reasonable concern. I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding of Westbridge's approach to community relations. We value robust discussion of our projects, including critical perspectives. That's how we improve our developments. Robust discussion is indeed valuable, Jensen interjected before Elizabeth could respond. However, police visits based on false reports, surveillance, and attempted unauthorized property access fall well outside the boundaries of discussion, robust or otherwise. Westman's attention shifted to Jensen, perhaps recognizing him now as the more unpredictable variable in this encounter. Professor Jensen, with all due respect, you're making connections between unrelated incidents based on speculation. If Professor Hackman has experienced harassment, that's regrettable, but attributing it to Westbridge without evidence is professionally irresponsible. Speaking of evidence, Elizabeth said, smoothly reclaiming control of the conversation, I've been compiling quite an interesting collection. Video documentation of surveillance vehicles, witness statements regarding the false housing inspectors, patterns of similar incidents in Phoenix, Portland, and Riverside, where Westbridge projects faced environmental opposition. She kept her tone conversational, as if discussing academic research rather than potential legal evidence. The momentary widening of Westman's eyes confirmed Elizabeth's tactical instinct. He hadn't expected her information gathering to extend beyond local incidents to establish cross-jurisdictional patterns. The developer recovered quickly, but the brief flash of surprise had been noted by both Elizabeth and Jensen. Anyone can make accusations, Westman countered, though his previous confidence had acquired a brittle edge. Establishing actual connections requires more than circumstantial parallels. Indeed it does, Elizabeth agreed pleasantly, which is why investigative journalists find financial structures so illuminating. The connections between shell companies, contractors, and parent corporations often reveal operational patterns that aren't visible at the surface level. The deliberate mention of investigative journalism, without directly referencing Jack Reynolds, registered in Westman's expression. The developer took a long sip of his wine, using the moment to recover his composure and reassess his position. Professor Hackman, he said after setting down his glass, I came here today to address your environmental concerns through scientific data and professional dialogue. Instead, you appear more interested in constructing conspiracy theories about routine business operations. Dr. Mercer shifted uncomfortably at this characterization, her eyes flicking between her employer and Elizabeth. The environmental scientist's discomfort suggested she had been brought to the meeting under pretenses that didn't include confronting accusations of corporate intimidation tactics. Mr. Westman, Elizabeth replied evenly, I engaged thoroughly with Dr. Mercer's environmental data for half an hour. My technical concerns remain valid and largely unaddressed by the mitigation proposals presented. As for conspiracy theories, I'm simply noting factual patterns that warrant explanation. Jensen, observing the dynamic with the analytical precision of an experienced academic administrator, chose this moment to shift the conversation into more concrete territory. Perhaps we could establish some clear parameters moving forward. Regardless of past actions or responsibilities, what matters now is ensuring Professor Hackman's safety and academic freedom remain uncompromised. This reframing, focusing on future conduct rather than assigning blame for past incidents, offered Westman a potential path toward de-escalation without admission. Elizabeth recognized Jensen's strategic approach and remained silent, allowing the developer to consider this option. The university takes any potential intimidation of its faculty extremely seriously, Jensen continued into the silence. We're prepared to implement whatever measures necessary to ensure Professor Hackman's security, including coordinated responses with law enforcement, legal action if warranted, and public statements regarding academic freedom. The implied institutional backing transformed what Westman might have perceived as an individual's resistance into something more formidable. Elizabeth watched the calculation in his eyes, weighing the costs of continued pressure against the potential consequences Jensen had outlined. No one wants escalation, Westman finally stated, his tone recalibrated to project reasonable conciliation. Westbridge values its community relationships. If Professor Hackman has experienced concerning incidents, I can assure you our company would never condone such actions. The careful phrasing, neither admitting connection nor explicitly denying it, wasn't lost on Elizabeth. This was the language of potential deniability, maintaining distance while acknowledging concerns just enough to seem responsive. Perhaps, Elizabeth suggested, maintaining her professional demeanor, we could establish some specific understandings. First, any surveillance or intimidation, regardless of source, stops immediately. Second, Westbridge addresses the substantive environmental concerns through proper scientific channels rather than pressure tactics. Third, we return to the standard regulatory process where evidence and community input determine project outcomes. Westman nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. Those are reasonable parameters for professional engagement, Professor Hackman, though I must reiterate that Westbridge has always operated within appropriate boundaries. As their lunch concluded with superficial pleasantries, Elizabeth and Jensen departed first, maintaining the initiative they had established throughout the encounter. Walking through the restaurant's elegant foyer, Jensen waited until they reached the privacy of the parking lot before speaking. He was rattled, the department chair observed, particularly by your mention of pattern evidence across jurisdictions and investigative journalism. That wasn't performative concern, that was genuine recalculation. Elizabeth nodded, reaching for her phone. I need to update the neighborhood group immediately. Westman's reaction suggests the harassment might stop, at least temporarily, but we shouldn't assume the matter is resolved. As they drove back toward campus, Elizabeth reflected on the encounter's subtle power dynamics. Westman had arrived expecting to manage a problem, an isolated academic whose resistance could be neutralized through implied threats and technical misdirection. Instead, he had encountered coordinated opposition with institutional backing, community support, and unexpected resources. The recording came through clearly, Elizabeth noted, checking the device Diane had provided. His careful non-denials regarding the harassment, combined with specific knowledge of incidents he claimed to know only through news reports, it creates a compelling narrative. Not evidence of direct involvement, Jensen cautioned, but certainly enough to justify continued vigilance, and more than enough to support the university's public statement on protecting academic freedom that the provost is preparing. Back at Elizabeth's house, the neighborhood coalition had gathered once more, this time with the addition of Aisha and her father, Robert Kim, from the city planning department. The kitchen table was covered with documents, satellite images of previous Westbridge development sites, technical assessments, and what appeared to be internal communications printed on corporate letterhead. Mr. Kim has been incredibly helpful, Mrs. Winters explained as Elizabeth entered. He's been tracking Westbridge's tactics across multiple jurisdictions for years. Robert Kim, a precise man with the careful demeanor of a career civil servant, nodded in greeting. Professor Hackman, your situation fits a concerning pattern. In 3 previous communities, Westbridge employed similar intimidation tactics against vocal opponents, always maintaining plausible deniability while applying increasing pressure until resistance collapsed. But this time they miscalculated, Tom Martinez added, his laptop open to a social media dashboard tracking Miguel's video, which had now been viewed over 50,000 times. They expected isolated resistance and encountered community solidarity instead. Elizabeth played the recording from her meeting with Westman, the group listening intently to the developer's careful phrasings and revealing hesitations. As the recording concluded, Robert Kim looked particularly troubled. His reference to routine business operations is almost identical to language used by Westbridge representatives in Portland when confronted with similar accusations, Kim noted. It's part of their standard response playbook: minimize, normalize, and imply that critics are overreacting to ordinary corporate practices. So what happens next? Miguel asked, the teenager's directness cutting through layers of adult analysis. They just back off and we win? Elizabeth exchanged glances with the assembled adults, none of whom harbored such optimistic simplicity. Corporate intimidation rarely ends with a single confrontation, Miguel. Westman may adjust tactics rather than abandoning his objective. Elizabeth's prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. As evening approached, Tom Martinez's security system alerted them to a vehicle stopping in front of her house. Instead of the now familiar surveillance sedan, a professional delivery van parked at the curb. The driver, wearing a crisp uniform, carried not an intimidating message, but an elegant envelope to Elizabeth's door. Special delivery for Professor Hackman, the courier announced when Elizabeth opened the door, the assembled neighborhood coalition watching cautiously from the kitchen. Signature required, please. Inside the envelope, Elizabeth found a formal letter on Westbridge Development letterhead. The carefully worded message announced the company's decision to temporarily pause their development project, pending additional environmental assessment that addresses community concerns. Attached was a press release scheduled for distribution the following morning, framing the decision as Westbridge's commitment to environmental stewardship and community collaboration. "This is a tactical retreat, not a surrender," Robert Kim observed after reading the documents. "They're attempting to control the narrative while regrouping." "And conveniently making no mention of the intimidation campaign," Tom added, scrolling through the press release on his tablet. "This presents Westbridge as the responsible party voluntarily addressing environmental concerns." Elizabeth placed the documents on her kitchen table, which had become the command center for their resistance. "They're trying to change the conversation, shift focus from their tactics to their apparent reasonableness." "Should we be celebrating or worrying?" Mrs. Winters asked, voicing the collective uncertainty. "Both," Elizabeth replied thoughtfully. "This represents a significant victory. They're backing down from immediate development plans, but Robert is right about it being tactical rather than absolute." The vibration of Elizabeth's phone interrupted their analysis, Jack Reynolds calling, his name displayed prominently on the screen. Elizabeth activated speaker mode to include the group in the conversation with her father's journalist friend. "Elizabeth, I've been following the developments in your situation," Reynolds began without preamble, his voice carrying the efficient directness of someone who had conducted countless investigations. "I understand Westbridge has announced a project pause." "News travels fast," Elizabeth observed. "They just delivered the press release to my home minutes ago." "I have sources inside their PR department," Reynolds explained matter-of-factly. "But that's not why I'm calling. My investigation into Westbridge's pattern of intimidation tactics has uncovered something significant. When cross-referencing similar incidents in other jurisdictions with Westbridge's development timeline, I found that each instance of harassment preceded substantial changes in project plans. The intimidation wasn't just about silencing opposition. It was about creating distraction while they modified proposals in ways that circumvented regulatory oversight." The assembled group exchanged concerned glances as Reynolds continued. "I believe the project pause announced today may serve a similar function, providing cover while they restructure their proposal to bypass the environmental concerns you raised at council." "That aligns with their previous practices," Robert Kim confirmed. "In Portland, they used a similar pause to reorganize their project under a different subsidiary, essentially restarting the approval process with modified plans that avoided previous objections on technical grounds." Reynolds' voice regained their attention. "Elizabeth, I'd like to publish an investigative piece connecting these patterns across jurisdictions. Your situation would be the contemporary example, but the focus would be on the broader corporate strategy of using intimidation as cover for regulatory evasion." The proposal hung in the air, presenting both opportunity and exposure. Publication would bring national attention to Westbridge's tactics, potentially deterring further intimidation. However, it would also irrevocably connect Elizabeth to the controversy, possibly affecting her academic career and certainly ending her previous privacy. "Would this include identifying me by name?" Elizabeth asked, her academic instinct for precise terms asserting itself. "Yes," Reynolds confirmed. "The piece would be stronger with your direct experience included, particularly given the documentation your community has compiled. However, I understand the professional implications and would respect your decision either way." Elizabeth looked around at the neighbors who had transformed from casual acquaintances into allies through this shared challenge. Their expressions reflected the complex decision before her, balancing personal considerations against broader principles. "I need to consider this carefully," Elizabeth finally replied. "When would you need my decision?" "My editor has allocated space in Sunday's edition," Reynolds answered. "I'd need your response by tomorrow evening to include your perspective properly." After the call ended, the kitchen fell silent, each person processing the potential implications of national exposure. Elizabeth's carefully constructed separation between her professional identity and her father's fame would inevitably collapse if the story ran with her name attached. You don't have to do this, Mr. Peterson said gently, breaking the silence. We've already achieved the immediate victory of pausing the development. But if Reynolds is right about them using this pause to restructure and evade regulations, Tom countered, then the victory is temporary at best. Elizabeth moved to her living room window, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood that had rallied around her with such unexpected solidarity. The evening light cast long shadows across familiar lawns where children played, retirees gardened, and families built their lives, trusting in basic security and stability. Westbridge's tactics had threatened not just her individual rights, but the community's collective sense of safety. I'll speak with Reynolds tomorrow, she decided, turning back to face her neighbors. This isn't just about me, or even our neighborhood anymore. If Westbridge has been using these tactics systematically, people should know. The following morning brought another unexpected development. Elizabeth's phone rang as she prepared for her constitutional law seminar, her father calling with news. Elizabeth, something interesting has happened, Gene Hackman began, his tone suggesting developments beyond their expected trajectory. I received a call from Harold Westman directly. Elizabeth sat down, surprised by this unforeseen connection. Westman called you? How did he even have your contact information? Hollywood is a small world in some ways, her father replied, with characteristic understatement. He claimed to be reaching out as one businessman to another, looking for a reasonable resolution to what he called a misunderstanding with you. What kind of resolution did he propose? Elizabeth asked, already anticipating some form of compromise intended to prevent further exposure. He offered to permanently withdraw the development proposal for your neighborhood and make a substantial donation to the university's environmental law program in your name, Gene explained. In exchange, he requested what he called discretion regarding speculative connections between Westbridge and certain regrettable incidents. The naked quid pro quo confirmed everything they had suspected about Westman's tactics, while simultaneously offering a seemingly perfect resolution. The development permanently halted, academic recognition for Elizabeth, and financial support for causes she valued. An elegant attempt at damage control, Elizabeth observed. Did he explicitly acknowledge directing the harassment? Not in actionable terms, her father replied. He spoke of overzealous contractors and miscommunications, while implying that further investigation would be unnecessarily damaging to all parties. What did you tell him? Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That you make your own decisions, Gene replied simply, and that intimidation tactics tend to be particularly ineffective against my daughter. When Elizabeth arrived at her constitutional law class that morning, she found her students unusually energized, laptops open to news sites reporting Westbridge's development pause. The story had expanded beyond Miguel's viral video to mainstream coverage questioning the company's practices. Professor Hackman, one student called as she arranged her materials at the podium. Are you going to be part of the national investigation into Westbridge's intimidation tactics? The Washington Post is reporting that a major expose is coming this weekend. Elizabeth surveyed the expectant faces before her, future lawyers, public servants, and citizens whose understanding of constitutional principles would shape the society they would help construct. The theoretical cases they studied in class had manifested in her driveway, at her door, in her neighborhood, transforming abstract legal concepts into lived experience. Before we begin our scheduled review, Elizabeth said, setting aside her prepared notes, let's discuss something fundamental about constitutional rights. They exist not as abstract ideals, but as practical protections that require active defense. When we speak of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, we're talking about real doors, actual privacy, concrete boundaries between state power and individual liberty. As Elizabeth wove the narrative of her experience, from police at her door to community resistance to corporate accountability, she recognized that her greatest contribution might not be in the upcoming newspaper expose, but in this classroom, where future defenders of constitutional principles were witnessing how academic knowledge translated into civic courage. That evening, Elizabeth called Jack Reynolds with her decision. The story would run with her full cooperation, connecting her experience to the larger pattern of corporate intimidation tactics. What Westman had failed to understand from the beginning was that intimidation only worked when targets remained isolated. By bringing neighbors together, connecting jurisdictions, involving institutions, and ultimately sharing the story nationally, what began as vulnerability had transformed into unprecedented strength. As Elizabeth stood on her porch that evening, watching neighbors chat across driveways and children play freely without the surveillance sedan that had become briefly familiar on their street, she reflected on how attempting to silence one voice had ultimately amplified many. The corporate playbook that relied on isolating opposition had instead catalyzed community solidarity that transcended the immediate conflict to establish lasting connections. The Constitution, she taught daily, wasn't just a historical document or legal framework. It was a living promise that required courageous defense by ordinary citizens standing together against intimidation. In schooling those who had come to her door expecting submission, Elizabeth and her neighbors had delivered a lesson more powerful than any courtroom precedent. Rights defended collectively become stronger, not weaker, when challenged.